So welcome to the Tualatin Historical Society and the Ice Age Floods Lower Columbia Chapter meeting. And the first thing I would like to do is to introduce Ross Baker, President of the Tualatin Historical Society.
Thank you, Sylvia. If you don't know who the Mazamas are, you should read up on them because it's a pretty crazy story. They were officially founded on July 19th, 1894 on the summit of Mount Hood by a group of 105 climbers. We like to think of ourselves as adventuresome at the Tualatin Historical Society, but I can in no way imagine us at the top of Mount Hood doing anything. In non-pandemic times, the Mazamas offer more than 900 hikes and 350 climbs annually for 13,000 participants. They also do a lot of stuff in the community. They have a variety of classes and activities. They do education, of course, climbing and hiking, but they all are focused on safety and perhaps even the most important, the protection of mountain environments. The name Mazamas, if you're into some trivia, it means mountain goat in the Aztec and Nahuatl, I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, language. It's really great that we have Matthew Brock with us tonight from the Mazamas. He's responsible for their library and historical collections. He's the manager of both. He has a master's in library and information science from the University of Washington. He has a bachelor's of social science from the University of Alaska Southeast. Actually spent 13 years in Alaska for reasons I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out because I'm really curious about that. He volunteers at the Oregon Historical Society, which is fantastic, and I'm sure that their president, Carrie Timchuk, appreciates that, having a well-qualified person like that available. And most interesting, I find, is he's a representative for Northwest Archivist. And archives, if you're into history, is what we're all about. And the world's not full of enough archivists as far as I'm concerned. He was, as a teenager, he first climbed South Sister, developed his love for mountaineering. And in Alaska, of course, he hiked and backpacked and rock climbed and stuff. But on the softer side of Matthew, he likes to travel, cook, and he likes to build stuff. The one thing I wanted to share with the organization tonight before we let Matthew take off is this incredible thing. You can't see it too well, but it is a Tuala 1916 edition. And inside, I'm not going to really go on the inside because I want to wear gloves when I get on the inside. It's actually your book from Tualatin High School from 1916. And Matthew and I met some weeks ago online when I was trying to figure out, why they had it in their collection. And I asked him, under what circumstances could he imagine that be allowed to transfer to our archives? And he did his homework, and he came back some days later, and he said, yeah, that's fine, that they understood the importance of that to the Tualatin Historical Society. It belonged actually to a very important person in their organization and their history, but he appreciated the merits of it being under the care of us as opposed to being in their library. And for that, I'll be forever thankful to Matthew. And so, Matthew, with that, I'm going to be quiet and let you get this show on the road.
All right. Well, thank you, Ross. And thank you, Sylvia. Thank you to the Tualatin Historical Society and the Ice Age Flood Institute for the opportunity to speak to you guys this evening. As Ross mentioned, my name is Matthew Brock, and I am the Library and Historical Collections Manager for the Mazamas. The story I'm going to share with you this evening spans roughly 20 years, from late 1894 until 1914. My intention tonight is to give you some insight into the early history of the Mazamas. I'll talk about Edward Curtis, as well as his brother Ashasl, and their time with the organization. Along the way, I'll weave in some other well-known individuals, including John Muir, Henry Pittick, and President Theodore Roosevelt. Before we go, I'd like to point out that this photo was taken by Edward Curtis on the Mount Rainier, the Mazama Mount Rainier outing in 1897. It's titled Reflection Lake at the Foot of Tatoosh Range, Mount Rainier. Our story starts with this man, William Gladstone Steele, pictured here on the left. His efforts influenced the story I'm going to share with you tonight. William Steele was born in Ohio in 1854. He lived in Pittsburgh and Oswego, Kansas, before moving to Portland, Oregon in 1872. While living in Kansas sometime around 1870, he first read about Crater Lake, supposedly in a newspaper wrapped around his lunch. That article about a lake hidden in the caldera of an extinct volcano would come to dominate his life and influence much of what he accomplished. After finishing high school, Steele tried his hand at several different occupations, including newspaper publishing, railroad promotion, real estate development, among others, before eventually becoming superintendent of the U.S. Postal Service, overseeing all the mail carriers in Portland. A few years after moving to the Northwest, Steele became interested in mountaineering. In the picture on the right, Steele stands with his leg propped up on the curb in front of his real estate development office around 1891. In 1885, Steele realizes a long-held dream when he visits Crater Lake for the first time. While he's there, he names Wizard Island and leaves in awe of the lake's majestic beauty. He returns to Portland, determined to do all he can to preserve this natural beauty. Steele gets right to work and pushes for legislation barring the proposed development of 10 town sites around Crater Lake. In 1886, he helps organize and lead the U.S. Geological Survey to Crater Lake to map and measure the lake's depth. A year later, in 1887, he realizes another dream when he co-founds the Oregon Alpine Club, the first society of mountaineers in the Northwest. He uses his experience and influence in 1890 to co-sponsor the O'Neill expedition to the Olympic Mountains in Washington State, then a vast expanse of relatively unknown territory outside of the handful of trappers and Northwest Indians that called the land home. Even though he was growing personally and professionally, he and another number of other members of the Oregon Alpine Club had become disenchanted with the direction that it was taking. One member is noted as disliking the, quote, elevator riding, unquote, mountaineers who were subtly changing the focus of the organization. Membership had been extended to, among others, the Oregon Camera Club, canoeists, civic boosters, and tourism promoters. In 1889, Steele assists in a reorganization of the Oregon Alpine Club to try to regain some of its alpine focus. However, his efforts were for naught. By late 1892, the Oregon Alpine Club had declared bankruptcy, even after Steele had gone so far as to sink $1,000 of his own money into the organization in an attempt to try to keep it afloat. Steele and a handful of other Oregon Alpine Club members quietly start meeting to draft a constitution, select a name, and pick a slate of officers for a new organization. Steele's dream of a great mountaineering club comprised of real mountaineers was to be inaugurated atop Mount Hood, and it was decided that climbing a glaciated peak would be a requirement for membership. In March of 1894, they launched their new endeavor with newspaper ads around the West. On the appointed day, over 350 people from all walks of life assembled in the small hamlet of Government Camp, some of them having traveled more than 3 days by horseback or buggy over rudimentary roads, where they set up an army of tents at the foot of Mount Hood. Noted Mazama historian John Scott wrote, despite a formidable thunder and sleet storm which turned back 100 would-be climbers, 155 men and 38 women gained the summit on Thursday, July 19, 1894. The piercing winds soon forced most of these to go below the sleet zone, but 40-odd hardy souls remained to formally organize the Mazamas and elect William Steele the first president. Later, 105 of those climbers signed up as charter members. Thus, from the ashes of the defunct Oregon Alpine Club was born the Mazamas. The photo on the left is the group of climbers reaching the summit of Mount Hood via the Cooper Spur route during the inaugural climb. On the right is a photo collage showing the newly elected Mazama members and the officers. It should be noted that the two vice presidents are women and that the female mountaineers have consistently made up between 1/4 and 1/3 of the membership since the organization's inception. According to Martin Gorman, writing in 1896, the mountain goat was chosen as the mascot due to the animal's mountain climbing sure-footedness. In addition, university linguists from both the east and the west coasts were consulted, and they confirmed that the word Mazama was the genus name for mountain goats, antelope, and American deer. The official badge is described as consisting of a circle enclosing a triangle with a dot in the center, with the erect head of a Mazama resting on a scroll bearing the name Mazama surmounting the whole. The triangle with the dot in the center is the conventional symbol for mountain used by the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey. The blue in the background represents the sky, while the white the alpine snow. The Mazama motto, which out of respect for the Chinook Indians, I will not attempt to say, loosely translates to "We climb high." The logo has remained relatively unchanged and continues to represent the organization to this day. The Mazamas of 1890 were explorers. The January 28, 1896 Oregonian quotes Steele talking about the ambitious scope of projects in store for the Mazamas. Quote, "The mountains of Washington and Oregon are now unapproachable to tourists. There is no botany of cascade flora, no maps, nor even altitudes of important peaks. All of this is the work for the Mazamas." An early Mazama stood a better than even chance of persevering and summiting a mountain. That was the good news. The bad news? They had to endure days of dog travel just to reach base camp, climbing in what amounted to old clothes, and sleeping in improvised sleeping bags made from 2 heavy woolen blankets held together with safety pins. For sustenance, early climbers often relied on oatmeal, prunes, canned beans, bacon, toast, jam, and coffee to fuel them up the trail. When it came to climbing, groups could number upwards of 100 individuals following the leader and being herded up the trail by an individual known as the rear guard. Rope was often just clothesline, crampons were unheard of, and ice axes, if they were around, were a curiosity. More commonly used were handheld alpenstocks, often crafted from the handles of old farm tools and nails. Early instructions to prospective climbers were simple: wear heavy hobnailed boots, 2 pairs of wool socks, bring an extra warm wind and waterproof coat, an alpenstock, and never forget the 4 G's: gloves, goggles, grease paint, and grub. By the way, the grease paint was used to ward off high altitude sunburn. This nasty concoction was mostly a mixture of lamp black and Vaseline. As John Scott notes, it was no trick to put on, but required a Turkish bath and sandpaper to get off. At the first meeting, not held on the top of a mountain, the officers of the Mazamas nominated and elected John Muir, the first honorary member of the Mazamas. Muir was a fitting choice for 2 reasons. He was the type of person many Mazamas strove to be, and he shared a kindred spirit for the preservation of natural wonders. In an article in the 1915 Mazama Annual, published a year after his death, Muir is described as a scholar, scientist, writer, horticulturalist, explorer, nature lover, conservationist, and most importantly, poet. He was all of those things and more. The memorial concludes, quote, "To love the flowered meadows, the white silences of the uplands, the templed groves, and the glacier-scarred domes," unquote, was not only to hold Muir in high esteem, but to gain entry into the world that he spent his life celebrating. Muir was also honored for his work to establish Yosemite as a national park that paralleled the years-long effort by William Steele to establish Crater Lake National Park. Steele and Muir met for the first time in 1888 on an early outing to Mount Rainier, and although the 2 were only acquaintances, they had common interests and exchanged correspondence for years to come. Their efforts to preserve Crater Lake and Yosemite would parallel and overlap. Both men received early local support, and their campaigns were endorsed by their state's major newspapers. They both gave public lectures to promote their causes, aided by the fact that each was a known climber and an advocate for the scientific study of the mountain environment. In 1890, Steele published his one and only book, The Mountains of Oregon, an anthology of essays on mountaineering and his park proposal. As Stephen Mark notes in his essay, 17 Years to Success, John Muir, William Steele, and the Creation of Yosemite and Crater Lake National Park, the book's title is interesting in light of an acknowledgement that Muir sent to Steele after receiving a copy. Quote, "I thank you for a copy of your little book, The Mountains of Oregon, and congratulate you on the success with which you have brought together in handsome shape such interesting and novel mountain material. Coincidentally, Muir would publish The Mountains of California 4 years later in 1894. Both men would also help co-found two organizations focused on enjoyment of the outdoors, Muir and the Sierra Club, and Steele first with the Oregon Alpine Club, and later and more successfully with the Mazamas. Steele returned to Crater Lake in 1896, leading the Mazamas on their first big outing as an organization. Their second outing, now called the annual outing, would be to Mount Rainier in 1897. Given the difficulty and time required, to say nothing of the logistics of reaching the mountains in the late 1800s, these outings were no small affairs. They often involved upwards of 100 people or more, traveling by boat, train, wagon, or on horseback over several days just to reach the site of their base camp. In addition to climbers, there were cooks and camp porters and wagon loads of supplies that were needed to support the huge party, sometimes for weeks in the wilderness. The outing to Mount Rainier generated nationwide interest in the Pacific Northwest, its mountains, and contributed substantially to the creation of Mount Rainier National Park a year and a half later in 1899. In addition to over 40 Mazamas, a contingent of climbers from California's Sierra Club, the Appalachian Mountain Club, and many eminent scientists rounded out the team. In addition to Steele, other notable members of the outing included owner and editor of the Oregonian newspaper and one of the first people to ever climb Mount Rainier, Henry Pittick, one of the first vice presidents of the Mazamas, and one of the first women to ever climb Mount Rainier, Mrs. Fay Fuller. Also along were Dr. E.W. Young and Mr. and Mrs. Edward Curtis of Seattle. Even though there were other more experienced Rainier climbers on the trip, Steele, Pittick, and Fuller among them, Curtis was selected as a climb leader due to his having spent considerable time on the mountain, climbing and photographing its many changing seasons. Prior to the climb, Curtis is said to have remarked to a friend, quote, "It will be a grand trip, but there are too many inexperienced people in the party, and I fear before we return, some accident will happen which will bathe the trip in gloom." Edward Curtis, seen here on the left with the backpack and satchel in hand, was born in Wisconsin in 1868. Early on, he was interested in photography and cameras. He built his first camera around the time he was in 6th grade. By the age of 17, he was an apprentice to a photographer in St. Paul, Minnesota. By 1887, his family had moved to Seattle, where Curtis had paid $150 to buy a 50% share in an existing photography studio. Within 6 months, he'd left, gained a new partner, and formed a new studio. In 1895, Curtis takes his first portrait of a Native American, Princess Angelina, daughter of Chief Salish of Seattle. Curtis would make a name for himself with his portraits of Native Americans, but his early work was mostly in landscapes, and many of those were taken on the Pacific Northwest's many mountain slopes. The Edward Curtis photographs held by the Mazamas are spread across several different collections, the two largest of which are the William Steele Scrapbook Collection and the Mount Rainier Outing Collection. Over the course of his life, Steele accumulated 28 large scrapbooks into which he glued and taped a wide variety of newspaper articles, personal correspondence, flyers, ephemera, notes, and photographs that caught his eye. One of the scrapbooks contains approximately 45 original Curtis prints. On Monday, July 19, 1897, the Mazama party left Portland by train bound for Tacoma. Over the next day, they would travel by train and then again by wagon, camping along the way at Eatonville and Carnahan Ranch before reaching the end of the road at Longmire Spring. This photograph was taken on the journey in, likely outside of Eatonville or near Longmire Spring. This is one of Edward's more stunning photographs of Mount Rainier, taken on the approach. It, along with a dozen other photographs, were later given to the Mazamas by Curtis. From Longmire Spring, the party hiked into Paradise Valley, where they set up their base camp. Curtis spent many seasons on Mount Rainier, climbing and photographing the mountain's many moods and angles. This photograph was likely taken on the hike in. Here we see Curtis playing with light and shadow and movement as the party crossed over the Marshall River. And this photograph comes from Paradise Valley, likely having been taken after they had established base camp and the party had gone out for conditioning hikes and exploring. Curtis captured this photograph of the Mount Rainier outing base camp. Not only can you see the mess hall and the mess hall tent in the background, but it also gives insight into what conditions were like to go camping in the 1800s. Here's a nice view of some of the accommodations at base camp. These canvas wall tents were common during the annual outings. You can see a stove chimney pipe poking out of the tent roof on the left. As the party explored Paradise Valley, Curtis captured 2 views of the falls at the head of the valley. On Saturday, several members of the party made a preliminary conditioning climb up Pinnacle Peak. Curtis took this great photograph of Rainier as seen between the crags atop Pinnacle Peak. This is one of the most unique Curtis images in the Mazama collection. While the majority of his photographs are landscapes and scenes of people, this one stands out because of its close nature and stark detail. Edward published a small 9-page brochure entitled Scenic Washington that listed all of the photographs that he took while on the 1897 outing. The titles and numbers you see on some of these photos, including this one, come from that brochure. On Monday, the party moved up the mountain to Camp Muir, and the first summit attempts were made. This photograph may have been taken on one of the conditioning climbs or on the principal climb itself. The majority of people made their summit push on Tuesday, the 27th. This photograph was most likely taken as part of the principal climb as the party reached the Stevens Glacier. Here, we see a lone climber perched on a rocky ledge overlooking the ice floe. There are a number of high camps on the route to the summit of Rainier. This one, appropriately enough, is called Camp Shivers. In the foreground, the backside of a climber can be seen wrapped in a blanket. Several other climbers lay cocooned in blankets below the ridgeline out of the wind. Their alpenstocks can be seen leaning against the rocks. This photo, taken on the slopes of Rainier, shows Curtis in the foreground leaning on his alpenstock with a number of other climbers in the background. After having spent the night at Camp Muir on the slopes of Rainier, the party departed early for the push to the summit. Curtis captured sunrise on Gibraltar Rock in this image. The party climbed on and reached the summit of Rainier by about 3:30 that afternoon. In this photograph, we get to see part of the climbing party. Edward Curtis is seated in the lower left with the white kerchief and the camera on his lap. Henry Pittock is seated sort of down in the bottom of the notch. And the woman between them, with the jaunty little hat and the black bow tie, is Ella McBride. And she went on she worked with Curtis for a couple of seasons and attempted to buy his photography studio in Seattle, and then eventually went on to become a pretty renowned portrait photographer in her own right, still lifes and portraits. So she was also on the trip. Of the 75 climbers who started out, 59 made the summit, a remarkable record for what we in modern day times would consider amateurs. As Curtis had feared before the outing began, the death of Professor Edward McClure of the University of Oregon, who fell during the descent, put a terrible damper on what had otherwise been a very successful climb and outing. In addition, 2 other climbers, Mr. H. Aisley and a Walter Rogers, were also almost killed on the same slope that killed Professor McClure. Curtis recreated the rescue of Walter Rogers for this photo. This and another original print were given to the Mazamas by Walter Rogers' descendants. In acknowledgement of his leadership efforts, the Mazamas made Curtis an honorary member in 1897. In 1898, Curtis again joins the Mazamas for then their 3rd annual outing, this time on the south side of Mount St. Helens. The mountain was then in a virtually trackless wilderness, and getting to it was a formidable undertaking. The nearest farms were miles away, and the sole avenues of approach were crude trails and wagon tracks through dense forest. The photo of Mount St. Helens, along with the next several images, were also part of the photographs that Curtis gave to the Mazamas in 1899. The Mazamas hired a team of mules to haul their gear from Portland to base camp. The mules, it turned out, were part of a much larger pack train that had been brought up from Mexico and were bound for Alaska. By all accounts, the mules were tired of walking. As they got progressively slower the further north they walked. The party of Mazamas soon found themselves far ahead of the pack train and were forced to stop and wait for it to catch up. One of the places they stopped to wait was at a place called Indian Creek, where Indian George had a small farm. While they were there, Curtis took this photograph of two men and a dog entitled Drawing of the Cascara Bark. Over his career, Curtis earned a reputation for being an ethnographer as well as a photographer. Lori Laylor, in her book Shadowcatcher, The Life and Work of Edward Curtis, writes that, quote, Curtis respected the Native Americans he encountered and was willing to learn about their culture, religion, and way of life. In return, the Native Americans respected and trusted him. When judged by the standards of his time, Curtis was far ahead of his contemporaries in sensitivity, tolerance, and openness to Native American cultures and ways of thinking. Eventually, the party was forced to abandon the pack train, and they hired a few local wagons to haul their supplies to base camp. In this photograph, we see a few members of the party and their camp. In this photograph, which Curtis titled Noon Rest of the Advanced Guard, shows a small party out on a hike. Much like the Mount Rainier outing, the St. Helens outing lasted for several weeks, and groups would often take conditioning hikes to see different areas and prepare themselves for the principal climb. Henry Pittock can be seen in this photograph, third from the left. He's got his hand, he's reaching up to hold the brim of his hat. Curtis made many important personal connections on this trip, including Frederick Colville, then the chief botanist of the United States, Mr. Warpole, a botanical artist, and A.J. Johnson, a forest authority and one of the leading scientists in the United States at the time. This wonderful photo shows the climbing party ascending the slopes of St. Helens. And here is the climbing party on the summit. Notice that the American flag in the background, although it is sort of hard to see, only has 45 stars on it. Edward Curtis would go on to many other adventures, most notably the Harriman expedition to Alaska and his 20-year quest to publish The American Indian, in no small part due to the people he met on his two Mazama outings. Edward's brother, Ashasl, began his photography career working with Edward, and his first assignment was a 2-year trip to Alaska and the Klondike to photograph its many gold-seeking miners. After working together for a couple of years, Edward and Ashasl parted ways forever after a bitter disagreement over the rights to Ashl's Yukon photos, which Edward had published under his own name. While it was rumored that Edward joined his brother Ashasl on the Mazama outing to Lake Chelan in 1899, there is no record of his involvement. There is no indication that Edward Curtis ever returned to climb with the Mazamas again. These are scans of an article that appeared in Harper's Weekly after the Mazamas Mount Rainier climb. The Mazamas have 2 copies of this issue, one of which, that's left over from a different presentation, my apologies. Ashasl Curtis followed his brother's footsteps by joining the Mazamas in 1899 and taking part in that year's annual outing to Lake Chelan in Washington State. More remote than the trip to St. Helens years before helped keep the number of participants low. The party set out to climb a group of unnamed peaks to the northwest of Park Creek Pass. Roughly 30 climbers began the ascent, but the number dropped after a near accident almost killed the climb leader, Dr. E.W. Young, you'll remember from the previous outing, who had also served as Edward Curtis's assistant on the Rainier and St. Helens climb. Young slipped on the icy snow on the way up and was saved from falling off a 300-foot cliff when he slammed into a fringe of stunted trees. The event so shook up the party that only 17 people completed the ascent. In this photo, taken after their ascent of Mount Shuckson, Ashasl is seated on the right, while fellow climber Montelius Price stands behind him. And a keen observer will have noticed that Ashasl is taking an early selfie. He's pulling a string to trip the shutter on the camera to get the picture. Ashasl returned in 1901 and joined the Mazamas on a return to Mount Hood. This, the 8th annual Mazama outing, was notable for several reasons. The Mazamas were joined by Professor Harry Fielding Reid of Johns Hopkins University. Professor Reid was along to study the many glaciers on the mountain. In the evenings, he gave talks around the campfire and was honored when the climbing party named Reid Glacier in his honor. Given the mountain's close proximity to Portland, the Mazamas got an impressive 97 climbers up and down the mountain safely. Ashasl took part in the 1902 annual outing to Mount Adams. The party left Portland by steamer, bound for White Salmon. From White Salmon, they traveled by stage to Trout Lake and then on to snow line of Mount Adams. After making camp at Happy Valley, the group spent several days waiting for the weather to clear by exploring the nearby areas before making an early morning start to the summit on July 21st. After 7.5 hours of, quote, unrelenting and unpitying steepness, unquote, the group reached the summit amid a bitter wind and a chilling mist that turned back several immediately. Those that remained were treated to a transformative scene that would remain, quote, the most striking of their mountain experiences, unquote. In an instant, one wrote, the fog parted asunder, the cloud cap burst into shreds, and the stupendous mountain outline and wild blue plains began to be visible through the rents, unquote. Within minutes, they could see Hood, Jefferson, and the Three Sisters, all as clear as if they were but a dozen miles away. The Mazama annual outing of 1905 was one of the largest yet for the young organization. In addition to the 51 Mazamas, they were joined by 58 climbers from California's Sierra Club. Ashasl, this time having moved to California, had switched to the Sierra Club, where he is listed as one of the 4 climb leaders for their group. The Sierra Club broke a record on the day of the climb by putting the largest party ever to reach the summit in one day. By all accounts, the two groups had a grand time, exchanging good-natured taunts and raiding parties between their respective camps, while sharing guiding responsibilities and gear over their 2 days spent on summit climbs. The Mazamas have none of Ashasl's photographs from the 1905 outing, unfortunately. This photograph of 5 dapper Mazamas is from the Kaiser collection. Ashasl joined the Mazamas one last time in 1906 as part of their annual outing to Mount Baker. The Mazamas set for themselves their most challenging endeavor yet to make the first ascent of Mount Baker from the northwestern side. The outing lasted 2 months and saw 120 members trek 20 miles through uncharted wilderness northwest of the mountain. They established a base camp named Camp Shoals for then President Charles Shoals on the shore of Lower Galena Lake. From the camp, the party undertook scientific investigations of the sulfur caves, steam vents, and an inventory of the flora of the northwest slope. They launched several exploratory trips to scout routes up the mountain and were awakened at 3 a.m. one morning when a forest fire arose 200 yards from camp. They cajoled a mule train bearing food, blankets, and supplies over 3 miles up to steep snowfields and across glacier crevasses to establish their upper camp. In the end, they made 3 ascents over 4 days, including one that involved a perilous straight-line climb up the Mazama Glacier, led by a hand-picked party of 6, including Ashasl. They named several geological features, including the Mazama Dome, and 4 glaciers, the grandest of which, Roosevelt Glacier, with its miles of castellated ice masses and surging avalanches, is said to have reminded Mazama President Charles Shoals of then U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt. This photograph, taken by Ashasl, shows the party on the slopes of Mount Baker, making their way to the upper camp. Over their careers, Edward and Ashasl's choices of subjects became increasingly different. Where Edward spent years documenting the traditional lifeways of Native American Indians, Ashasl focused on photographing Washington State's natural resources, industries, cities, towns, historic events, and its growing population. That same year, the Mazamas would nominate President Theodore Roosevelt for honorary membership a second time. The first time they nominated him in 1905 because of his, quote, lifelong interest in mountains, forestry, natural scenery, and particularly for his interest and assistance in creating Crater Lake National Park. When Roosevelt signed the legislation creating Crater Lake National Park in 1902, it marked the end of a 17-year effort by William Steele, who considered it his greatest achievement. Roosevelt had been a key figure in the adoption of the park, as he had influenced the House of Representatives to debate the Crater Lake legislation. Unbeknownst to Roosevelt, his secretary declined the Mazamas' first invitation. A few months later, in February of 1906, Roosevelt accepted honorary membership in the American Alpine Club. The deeply offended William Steele fired off a letter to the president asking why he'd accepted the American Alpine Club's offer but declined the Mazamas. A series of contentious letters flew back and forth between Washington, D.C. and Portland. Once it became clear that Roosevelt was unaware of the initial nomination and its subsequent rejection, the president apologized for the misunderstanding and accepted the Mazamas' offer. The Mazamas renominated him in August 1906, an action that prompted a still upset and offended William Steele to resign his membership. Several years passed as the Mazamas debated the issue, and Mazama President Charles Sholes tried to soothe Steele's bruised pride. The Mazamas eventually made Roosevelt an honorary member in 1913. As a thank you, he sent along this photo of himself with one of his hunting trophies from his great African expedition in 1909. William Steele would not rejoin the Mazamas, the organization he founded until 1921. He would remain a member until his death in 1934. In their first 20 years, from 1894 to 1914, the Mazamas mounted successful climbs of Mountains Hood, Jefferson, Adams, St. Helens, Rainier, Baker, Shasta, Glacier Peak, Three Sisters, many of them multiple times. They organized and printed the Mazama Annual, and later in 1928, a monthly bulletin, both publications that continue to this day. They sent scientific expeditions to measure the elevations of Rainier and St. Helens, as well as to document the geology, ecology, glaciology, and meteorology of the majority of Northwest peaks. The organization was honored with the naming of Mount Mazama, the extinct volcano whose crater cradles Crater Lake. They named Mount Sahali from the organization's Chinook Indian motto, and in their first conservation project, lobbied successfully to save the Cascade Range Forest Reserve from public sale. What began as William Steele's dream of a new mountain club with 105 members on the summit of Mount Hood has grown over the last 126 years into an organization 3,600 members strong. Currently, as Ross pointed out, we lead roughly somewhere between 900 and 1,000 hikes a year, about 300 climbs. Those numbers are off a little bit because of the pandemic. Obviously, we haven't been able to do that, but on average, that's what it is. We continue to provide educational opportunities across a wide variety of areas, and we continue to fund scientific and conservation activities. The Mazama Library and Historical Collections are honored to have the Curtis brothers' photographs as part of our holdings. Together, their images give life to the early days of the Mazamas and to the early history of mountaineering in the Northwest. I hope you all have enjoyed this short journey through our history as much as I have enjoyed sharing it with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was excellent. I'm not hearing myself. Okay. Can you hear me, Matthew?
I can.
Oh, good. Okay. So at this time, we will take anyone who has questions. You can either use the respond down below where you can raise your hand or put it in the chat. If no one else is speaking, you can just speak up and we'll see what questions there might be. Make sure and unmute if you're going to ask a question.
I have a question, Sylvia. I noticed in those photographs a lot of women in the organization. I think for that time it was pretty amazing. Matt, what do you know about that?
The Mazamas was and is unique. From the very beginning, women were allowed in as full-fledged members. For mountaineering organizations at the time, that was very unconventional. As an example, the Alpine Club, the very first one that's based in London, didn't allow women at all until 1970, and then only in as women's auxiliaries. William Steele, we've got a quote in one of a newspaper. He was interviewed, and he said, you know, there's no reason they shouldn't be involved. women are perfectly capable and have been allowed in as full voting members from the very beginning. Our first female first female climb leader led climbs up Hood in 1913, I think. And the first all women's climb was in 1930. We had our first female president in 1950, a good 30 years before any of the other mountaineering organizations had female presidents. So very progressive in that sense. Yeah.
So we have one
I have
question.
I have a question.
Oh, hang on. Somebody put one in the chat. They wanted to know if I inherited the library from Vera and if she's still around. Yes, Vera is still around. I didn't inherit the library from her, but she definitely gave me a lot of direction.
So I have a question.
Okay.
My son was a member of Mazamas as an explorer scout in 1980, 1979, 1980. Do you still sponsor an explorer scout chapter for?
Currently, no. Currently, the Mazamas does not sponsor an explorer scout. We were very active in the Explorer Post program for, if memory serves, about 20 or 30 years. And I think that sort of came to an end in the late 80s, early 90s.
I see.
I'm not sure. I haven't delved into the history of that. I just know that there was, it might even been later. It may have been into the 90s that we were involved in that, now that I think about it. But we're not currently.
Well, he really enjoyed it. He climbed, I think you had to climb 3 mountains to be for Mazamas, if my memory serves me right. That was the requirement back in those days.
Well, the requirement to become a full-fledged member is that you still have to climb a glaciated peak. So you have to climb a mountain with a living glacier on it. Yeah.
Glaciated peak, yes.
Yeah. There was a movement for a while to try to make it 3 peaks, to make it even more exclusive. But there is an effort afoot right now within the organization to do away with that requirement, because there's a lot of members. We have a lot of people that engage with the organization that don't necessarily want to be high alpine climbers, myself included. I'm much more of a hiker and a backpacker, and I'm high alpine mountaineering is not really my thing. And it's also prohibitive. It really makes it hard for other people to join, particularly hikers. I mean, we serve 30,000 hikers a year. And if they're not interested in climbing the glaciated peak, then it's a huge barrier to entry to get involved with the organization.
Okay, we've got a couple more questions in the chat. So do you see those, Matthew?
Yes. Can you talk more about conservation efforts, especially in the later 20th century? Yeah, absolutely. The very first conservation effort started with Steele, and that was his efforts to preserve Crater Lake. They went on to help preserve what eventually becomes the Willamette National Forest. They pushed very hard to keep, there was an effort, I can't remember exactly when, to shrink the size of the Olympic National Park in Washington. The Mazamas really fought against that to keep it from, they were going to try to shrink it. The Mazamas actually tried to expand it a little bit, if memory serves me correctly. And then they've also fought pretty hard against several different efforts to put gondolas and tramways up Mount Hood and Mount Rainier and Mount Adams, I think. So those have been some conservation efforts. And then more recently, we do a lot of funding. We give out a lot of conservation grants. There's been a lot of work done out in Eastern Oregon, removing fences, wildlife or wild range rehabilitation, some work done on the Oahe, sort of non-mountaineering related stuff, but definitely conservation in conservation efforts for sure. Let's see, other questions. There was, noticed that women wore skirts. When did that end? We have a fantastic photo in the collection of a group that was sort of breaking barriers, and everybody in the photo, men and women, and I think this is in the 30s, went hiking in shorts. And apparently that was like very controversial at the time. But it starts to end sort of around there. You start seeing, it's really interesting because women on these outings, what you see is women in pants, when in town and, in proper society, they were still required to wear dresses or skirts, but out in camp and climbing, they were, they sort of got away with wearing pants or bloomers. So that it slowly starts to change. But the 30s is, I think, when you really start to see the skirts drop away and women start wearing even shorts climbing, which was pretty scandalous at the time. What are the current membership requirements? The current membership requirement is you still have to climb a glaciated peak to become a member. But as I mentioned, there is a movement afoot to try to change that, to try to get rid of that. Are we looking for family photos of early members such as the original lodge? Absolutely. We are always looking for photos. I'm not in the archive, but I took a picture of the archive as my backdrop. And so this is, that's our rare book collection. This is our part of our archive. And we have well over 1 million photographs in our collection, not counting digital. That's just print images. So yes, we're always looking for photographs, particularly mountaineering and lodge photos. Yeah. If you've got interior shots of the original lodge, that is very rare. There are very few photographs of the inside of the lodge. Scott has a comment. Where are you, Scott?
Absolutely great talk. I totally enjoyed it. I've been a member of Mazamas for 25, 30 years. But as a professor at Portland State, you guys support so many students and doing research in the mountains. And I just think that the Mazamas, it's something that people don't realize, the amount of money that you put into supporting gathering data for all of the mountains. And then your collection that you've got there is just phenomenal too. I totally enjoyed your talk tonight. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, the Mazamas, I mean, obviously as mountaineers, they spend a lot of time on mountains. We did some of the very first glacier research in the area. And that collection gets used by the glaciology and the geology department at Portland State all the time. I just had his, thank you. I just had it and I lost it. Dr. Fountain was made an honorary member of the Mazamas 2 years ago for his work in glacier research and mountain ecology in that area. And when the library is open in non-pandemic times, I do get a lot of PSU students, glacier students, and geology students coming in to look at our collection. And the Mazamas also were some of the first to utilize airplanes to study glaciers and photograph the mountains. So that's another big part of our collection, are aerial photos of all of the mountains and the glaciers all over the Northwest. So that's another big part of the collection that gets used. The Mazamas have had 3 lodges. The very first one was built up near Rhododendron, sort of on the low slope of Mount Hood. And then in the 30s, I believe it was, the state decided to start keeping the road over the pass open year round. And when that happened, the Mazamas moved and built a new lodge just outside of government camp. And that's the big, beautiful log lodge, the original log lodge. And it burned down in 1959. And that was a huge loss. I mean, it was a beautiful building, and I have, I think, 3 photos of the interior. So we have nobody now knows what it looks like, what it looked like inside. And then after that one burned down in 59, they built the current lodge, which is still there on the same foundation. And it's still outside of Mount Hood, just up the road from Government Camp. In fact, on the way, if you're driving up to Timberline, it's about 50 yards up when you come off of the highway and you headed up, there's a very small little sign on a tree that says Mazama, and it points into the woods. And that, if you take that road, it takes you to the lodge. It's sort of nestled back in the trees.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
I think I got all the ones in the chat.
Yes, I was looking that over. I believe you did too. So thank you so very much. Let's give them a hand or a thumbs up, whichever you do. And thank you for being our speaker tonight. Very, very enjoyable.
Well, thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit of our history with you.
All right. Thank you.